Special pleasure for me to welcome you to Columbus because this was the scene of my very first AAPS meeting 30 years ago. And after meeting Dr. Lightheart and Dr. Jordan and so many other wonderful AAPS members, I have not ever missed a meeting since then. I enjoy this meeting about MOC and MOL particularly because I think it's the first time ever that we've discussed an issue in which I think 95% of American physicians will agree with us. And the elitists who are in charge of it still think they're going to win. We have learned a lot today about what a costly and hassle this all is, and I think there's a lot more to it than that. I think that it's an assault on our profession and that many physicians instinctively realize that it's part of what Leonid Paretsky will say in upcoming issue of our journal is part of the Sovietization of American medicine. A Soviet is the administrative structure after that the Bolsheviks put into effect was run by apparatchiks who knew very little about what they were regulating but had tremendous power, and it set up all types of paperwork and regulations and requirements and plans. And of course, all of the plans were always achieved on paper. It is a way of forcing physicians into a mold, and it's not just about assessing your knowledge and making sure that you can pass an examination. It's about changing your practice. All of these practice improvement modules assume that you're going to be practicing according to the best practices that this elite has decided for us. I don't think we've learned anything since the time of Semmelweis. Just recently in the General Surgery News, I read about the case of Dr. Kurt Sem, who was a pioneer in laparoscopic surgery. His colleagues forced him to have a brain scan because they thought he was brain damaged, and they cut off his microphone and his slide projector in the middle of a presentation because they thought laparoscopic surgery was unethical. And it's not just the end of innovation and the rigidifying protocols, but it's about changing our very medical ethics. Our ethics have been the idea that we put our patients first, that we're serving our patients to the best of our knowledge and judgment. But now the new ethics with the physician charter is that the good of society is supposed to come first. I read a book recently by Al Johnson about the new ethics in which the Good Samaritan was actually the villain because he was motivated by compassion, and he took care of this one guy lying in the ditch with giving no concern for all of the other needy people throughout the world who weren't getting services. I had a really shocking conversation with a medical student last week or this week, and I wonder if the medical students here have had a similar experience, but he told me that his professors had told him that the only way to solve the problem of the skyrocketing cost of medical care was to make sure that we stopped spending money on too much end-of-life care, on feudal care, and that if he didn't get with the program and do that, he was not going to be able to make a living. And then if you had a politically incorrect point of view, your career could be trashed by one bad recommendation. Well, this whole idea of the useless eaters and the lebensunwertes Leben, or the life unworthy of life, has to remind you of some other atrocities that occurred during the 20th century that, of course, can't happen here, but then, of course, they weren't supposed to be able to happen there in one of the most civilized countries in the history of the world either. So I recommend for your reading enjoyment a book that I recently found, They Thought They Were Free. The Germans, 1933 to 1945. It is written by Milton Meyer in 1955. He was an American newspaperman, a Jew of German descent, who decided to go to Germany to befriend and get to know 10 ordinary, decent Germans who joined the Nazi Party and try to understand what was going on at the time. Well, they joined the party partly because they wanted a job, and partly because most Germans thought that the Nazis were doing good things for Germany. I mean, they were helping the economy, for one thing, And so it was, to do something good. And the atrocities only came about later, and step by incremental step. And it was found, Meyer pointed out, that if you didn't resist the first step, how were you going to protest the second one, which wasn't really all that much worse? Kind of reminds me of Rudy Giuliani's approach to crime control in New York City. If you want to really control the big crime, you got to stop the ones who are jumping the turnstiles too. You've got to stop it early. He also found that the Germans really didn't have any definite knowledge of what was going on, or at least most of them didn't. They suspected there was all kinds of evidence, but they didn't really know about the worst of the atrocities, or they had to they could deny it. And one reason for that was that originally people who went to places like Buchenwald, when they were released, they were ordered not to speak about their prison experience. And they didn't, they were afraid to. Well, these days, of course, we don't have places like that, but we do have re-education programs for disruptive physicians. And they're afraid to talk about it. There will be an article in the upcoming journal about one doctor's experience. It'll be anonymous, and I will be the stated author. And the other thing was that these Nazis didn't have time to think. There were so many meetings, there was so much paperwork, there were so many regulations, there was so much going on that they really didn't have time to think. And what do you think is going on with MOC? You're constantly involved in all of this busy work. You don't really have time to think about the big picture and what's happening, what's corroding the ethics that are going on. What Meyer said that we needed to do was resist the beginnings and look forward to the end and understand the end. This, of course, is easier said than done because we don't really understand what's going about at the beginnings. At this meeting at the Benjamin Rush debate at the Benjamin Rush Institute, where Andy Schlafly was one of the presenters, and also Dr. Kempen, and the other side, Martin Levine, who was formerly president of the American Osteopathic Association, who's got a really good deal to get recertified. And there you have to pay your $800 dues to the AOA every year. They're even worse than the AMA in that respect. But he said, well, it all started with licensure. So we're in a cage of our own making, and there's nothing we can do about it at this late date. So just get used to it. Just go along with it, even though it's supposedly voluntary. APS has been about resisting the beginnings, but if you resist that too early, people think you're a bunch of cranks. And I think people have said that about us. We resisted Medicare when it came about. But what really were the beginnings? Well, Meyer said the beginnings in Nazism were in 1937 with a surprising insight that he had. It was the Volkswohlfahrt, which was the German welfare system that fed the hungry. And Meyer at first was shocked when someone told him that. He said, well, that was the only decent thing the Nazis ever did. They fed the hungry. Well, the Germans were not uncharitable people. At that time, there were many of them who ate bread crusts, so they would have a little something left over to give to people who were even poorer than they were. But under the Nazis, this was automatic, and it happened so much more efficiently, and people were better provided for, it seemed. But it was without the love, without the person-to-person interaction that brought this about. And the Nazis used it to consolidate the power of the government and to actually make people hate each other. Well, as Meyer pointed out, something that he experienced in 1931 to the winter of 1931 and 1932, the time of the Depression in America. And he said, I was eating a steak at a window table in a restaurant, and I saw a man outside looking in. He had a ragged topcoat, and he was holding a child in his arms. I couldn't give him half my steak, but I could vote for Roosevelt. And the WPA got them off the street. So all of his obligations to his fellow man occurred because he voted for Roosevelt. And then Meyer pointed out, this is in an article in The Progressive in 1950 from kind of this unlikely source, although you have to consider that he was, after all, quoting another Jew, when he said, that the book says that though we bestow all our goods to feed the poor, and though we give our bodies over to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth us nothing. And what our current system is doing is extirpating charity, extirpating our love for our patients, extirpating our love for the art. And this is an evil thing, even though it appears that they're doing all kinds of good deeds. So what can we do now to fight against this drastic change in the medical profession that will have a very bad end? Even if we can't completely foresee it right now, we'll be considered paranoid if we try to predict some of the bad things that might happen, such as, starving and dehydrating our old people to death while we oversedate them. Well, some of the things that happened in Germany may have been partly because of the national character. There's some very interesting things in Meyer's book. He talks, for example, about the failed but attempted putsch in 1944 against Adolf Hitler. And he said the interesting thing about that was not that it failed, but that it was so un-German, that there are maybe some certain national characteristics. The Germans' incapacity for calm, consistent insubordination, for being first and last, a free man, is the key to his national history. And there's a little vignette in here about certain types of national characteristics. He talks about, I guess this is an apocryphal disaster that occurred on June 14th, 1907, the day that the entire temperate zone was hit head-on by the worst heat wave in history. And throughout the temperate zone, there was a rule, and all the placards and the streetcars said that the windows of the streetcars shall not be opened until June the 15th. Well, how did the people react in various countries? In Leeds, an English writer called the attention of the Yorkshire Post to the situation in a strong letter. And after the letter was picked up by the Times, a parliamentary debate ensued and the Liberal government fell, ostensibly on the issue of window regulation. In Lyon, a tram passenger cried, "Liberté!" and drove his fist through the window, and the sight of his bleeding hand inspired riots throughout the city. The Swiss cabinet, in an emergency session, ordered that fans were to be installed at once in all of the municipal railway cars. And in Hanover, a German, having read the placard and consulted his mechanical pocket calendar, sat back in his seat, kept his coat on, and read his paper. But then that evening, he beat his small son, who 20 years later joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. And in Omaha, an American opened the streetcar window. This is the American way, and I hope that it's our way. It's really the AAPS way. It's just non-participation with all of the evil that's going on around us. Could have quite a remarkable effect and could save us from falling into these pitfalls. But speaking of insubordination brings us to our featured speaker of the evening, Dr. John Hunt. He, like many other people, sent me a book, a copy of his book called Assume the Physician, with some beautiful picture of sheep on the front cover. And I thought, oh, well, okay, somebody else sent me a book. I will page through it and read a few pages. And I just kept reading and reading and reading. And I fell in love with his insubordinate protagonist, who had a lot of delightful ideas that will appeal to us. He loved his patients, I think here and also in Africa, where he has a charitable mission and has some really interesting proposals that I think would appeal to you. I hope you will buy his book and let him sign it, but I do warn you, you should not read it on the way home if you feel that you might be embarrassed if you're caught laughing out loud in public on the airplane. Dr. John Hunt is a pediatrician, an allergist, immunologist, and a pulmonologist, and he will speak to you now. Thank you.